Hello, my name is Marina, and today I'm going to present to you the topic of cognitive biases and prejudicial thinking. The cognitive thinking biases that shape varieties of prejudice, like racism, have a considerable impact on perception, judgment, and decision making mechanisms. The collection of biases, which include the anchoring bias, confirmation bias, representative bias, recency bias, and availability heuristics, fundamentally affect the decision making and thus rise the prejudicial mentality and provide justification for discriminatory behaviors. Deciphering the workings of these biases is an important component in recognizing the methodology of racism through society. I'm going to begin with the anchoring bias. This means relying too heavily on the first obtained information and using it as a basis for making decisions. Regarding racism, anchoring bias can be displayed when a person's first impression on an individual is based on a racial stereotype or prejudice. Suppose a person grows up in a community where negative stereotypes about a particular racial group are prevalent. For instance, they might hear a repeated assertion that members of this group are lazy or prone to criminal behavior. As a result, when they encounter individuals from that racial group, their initial perception may be anchored around these stereotypes, leading them to view all members of the group through a biased lens, regardless of individual characteristics or actions. One real life example for the anchoring bias is in the hiring process. This can affect how employers perceive candidates of different races. If a candidate of color provides a salary expectation or previous salary that is lower than average, it may serve as an anchor, leading the employer to offer a lower salary than they would for a similarly qualified candidate of a different race. Conversely, if a candidate of color provides a higher salary expectation, it may lead the employer to perceive the candidate as overreaching or less desirable, even if their qualifications warrant a higher salary. Next up, we have the confirmation bias, having the tendency to look for, interpret, and accept only the information that confirms one's initial thinking, while denying or discrediting the data that contradicts that thinking is known as the confirmation bias. In regard to racism, confirmation bias can be charged with reinforcing and sustaining the stereotypes based on the conviction that certain ethnic groups are less human by looking for the information that confirms the existing stereotypes. Consider someone who holds prejudiced belief about a certain racial group. If they come across news stories or anecdotes that seem to confirm these beliefs, such as reports of crimes committed by members of that group, they may give disproportionate weight to such information while disregarding instances where members of the same group exhibit positive traits or contribute positively to society. This selective attention to confirming evidence reinforces their pre existing prejudices. And again, some real life examples. In some school systems, there is evidence of racial bias in tracking students into different academic programs or systems. Teachers or administrators may hold lower expectations for students from minority racial or ethnic groups, leading them to be disproportionately placed in lower level classes or programs. This confirmation bias perpetuates inequalities in educational outcomes by limiting opportunities for advance based on race rather than ability. Next, I'm going to talk about the representative bias. The problem of representative bias entails individuals basing their judgment on stereotypes or prototypes instead of considering the characteristics of individuals or actual evidence. In relation to racism, stereotyping involves a mispresentation of characteristics or behavior of whole racial group in accordance with limited data or myths. This can in turn lead to the fact that a particular racial group is being treated unjustly. Meanwhile, the individual qualities of these people are not being considered, including the circumstances under which they live. Imagine a scenario where a person assumes that all individuals from a particular racial group share the same characteristics or behavior based on stereotypes or limited interactions. For example, if someone believes that all members of a certain racial group are aggressive or unintelligent, they may treat individuals from that group unfairly without considering their individual differences or circumstances. Again, it is time for the real life example. Security personnel may exhibit representative bias by disproportionately subjecting individuals who fit certain racial or ethnic profiles to additional security screening based on stereotypes about terrorism or criminal activity. For example, individuals who appear Middle Eastern or South Asian may be more likely to face heightened security, even though the vast majority of people from these backgrounds are not involved in terrorism. On our list, we have the recency bias. This refers to the tendency to give greater weight to the most recent information on experience when making judgment or decision. It is the recency bias that can influence people's perception of racism by preferring the most recent events or cases involving a particular racial group. Suppose there's a surge in media coverage of crimes committed by members of a specific racial group over a short period. People exposed to this coverage might develop a heightened fear or suspicion of individuals from that group, even though crime rates among other racial groups might be comparable or even higher. The recent prominence of these incidents can disproportionately influence perceptions and contribute to the prejudiced attitudes. And once again, we have a real life example. In workplaces where incidents of racial discrimination or harassment have occurred recently, employees may be more likely to perceive subsequent actions or decisions through the lens of those events. This can lead to heightened sensitivity to racial issues and an increased likelihood of interpreting ambiguous behavior as discriminatory even if it is not. Finally, we have availability heuristics. This is a mental shortcut that implies that you have the feeling of the probability of the event depending on how many examples you can recall. When it comes to racism, the availability heuristic may lead people to exaggerate the prevalence of bad habit or bad behavior in public if they remember those things better or if they were shown a lot of that in the media. This can contribute towards the persistence of stereotypes and prejudice as well as the strengthening of the perception that certain racial groups are more closely associated with certain characteristics or patterns of conduct. Consider a situation where instances of negative behavior by members of a particular racial group are widely publicized or sensationalized in the media. Even if such behavior is statistically rare or not representative of the entire group, the frequent exposure to this narrative can lead people to overestimate the prevalence of such behavior among all members of that racial group. This can reinforce stereotypes and contribute to discriminatory attitudes and behavior. And this is the last real life example. Following high profile acts of terrorism committed by individuals from certain racial or ethnic background, people may become more fearful or suspicious of individuals who share similar characteristics. For instance, after terrorist attacks prepared by individuals of Middle Eastern descent, there may be increased prejudice against individuals perceived to be of Middle Eastern or Muslim origin. I can happily say that I have never experienced racism, but I have a couple of personal examples. The first one is for the confirmation bias, but also the availability heuristics. While playing a popular online game Among Us, I was chatting with the people in the room, and we were sharing about where we are from to understand each other better. I mentioned that I am from Bulgaria, and one of the girls in the game said, "Oh, this is in Russia, right? Can you say something in Russian?" No, I can't say something in Russian because I am not Russian. The other example is basic. It is for the representative bias. I was out with my boyfriend just driving around. It was still the beginning of our relationship and he still hasn't seen my driving abilities. I asked him if I could drive home instead of him. He looked at me shocked and said, "I will never let a woman drive my car." Based on the fact that I am a woman, he automatically thought that I am unable to drive well. In fact, after a while, he got in my car so that I drive well and carefully, and now he lets me drive his car from time to time with a lot of persuasion, though. And finally, a mini conclusion of everything I said. Cognitive thinking biases, which include anchoring bias, confirmation bias, representative bias, recency bias, and a phenomenon known as availability heuristics, can all contribute to prejudiced thinking, such as racism, by causing perception bias reinforcing stereotypes and altering decision making processes. Uncovering and getting the point of all these stereotypes is necessary for expelling racism and progressing more empathy, understanding, and inclusiveness in the society. However, the quest for equality and justice start back at home. Probably understanding our own bias and getting acquainted with different people with various perspectives could be a way to start making a better world for all. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the second video presentation.